gosh, is it not working? You can't turn your camera. Is it?
Well, we sort of went to grad school together.
Is it working? It is working.
Program, and she came right after me, but then we knew each other from Jordan. So she worked there for a while. I worked there. She came out just as I left. She's stagnant. Yeah. Didn't know.
Should we go for it? Yeah, go for it. Okay,
Well,
y'all ready?
Now we are.
And your mic.
That's off. Hey everybody, how are you? I'm Aaron Huertas. I'll be your MC for this discussion, and I'm joined by a great set of panelists here. I just want to introduce everybody briefly. We'll have some opening remarks, and then we'll open it up for questions and conversation. So I'm a political consultant by trade, and I've also worked a bit in science communication and science advocacy. I just recently joined Swing Left, which is working to take back the House for Democrats. So I've kind of transitioned from science advocacy more over to electoral work. And podcasts are definitely part of my work, which I'll get into in just a little bit. To my left is Doug Parsons. He runs the America Adapts podcast. To his left, Colleen McDonald, my former colleague from the Union of Concerned Scientists, who runs their Got Science podcast. And then this is Jordan Cooper, and Jordan runs the Public Interest podcast. He is also a candidate for delegate in Maryland. So a podcaster who is running for office, talks a lot about policy and political issues. So just to kick it off a little bit, I think the political sphere's attitudes towards podcasts have evolved a lot. We used to think of podcasts as totally separate from mainstream media, or maybe something that you didn't know whether or not you wanted to put your executive director on a podcast to talk to them, or have your candidate talk to someone who's doing a podcast. And I think over the past couple of years, and especially since the last election, we realized that podcasts, especially podcasts that really dive into political issues, they're where your most committed and your most engaged members of your audience are often going for information. So a couple different types of podcasts that I've seen pop up in our space. One is Pod Save America. Any Pod Save America listeners? Right, so ex-Obama folks who now, their party is out of power, they're going to alternative media to talk to their audience in a really direct way. So in addition to the podcasting, they're doing live events, they're connecting people to organizations like Swing Left and Indivisible. So, listening to it, being a fan of their podcast, you're getting pushed into essentially a marketing funnel, right? But it's politics, it's an activism funnel towards stuff you can do to help with their political goals. There's also a bunch of podcasts that have popped up sort of to the left of the mainstream liberals to challenge the liberal establishment, and those will have followings. Chapo Trap House is like the top Patreon, and that Patreon just pays for their podcast. So those are a group of folks in New York who are challenging Democrats and liberals from the left, and they've built a really passionate following. How big is that following? It's maybe about 20,000, 30,000 people, but it's a really impassioned following online. It's a lot of people who are going out and knocking doors and joining groups like their local Democratic Socialist of America organizations, which have been resurgent in a lot of places. And I think this mirrors what's happened in the political right with podcasting too, where we've had really strong alternative media for people to tune into that fits in with their ideology, that fits in with how they want to think about politics, and importantly, it's linking people to actions that they want to take. Finally, I think this is true for a lot of organizations, a lot of podcasts that don't necessarily think of themselves as political, but are asking themselves, how am I relevant like in this moment right now, and how interested is my audience going to be in politics and policy? So one podcast I got to see, they did a live show in Madison connected to a science conference that I was at, and it's Gastropod. So it's a food podcast. And initially, why would they be interested in politics or policy? But they were able to, as part of their live show, bring in a professor from the University of Madison who studies the history of how we regulate food safety. And he got to tell all these fascinating stories, some of which were kind of disgusting, about tainted food and things like that. But he approached it through this lens of the history of food regulation and the politics of food. And it was not partisan at all. It was just the history of that topic as we've treated it through politics and policy. So I see a lot of that cropping up in the podcasts I listen to and in the causes that I care about too. So with that, America Adapts.
It's technically America Adapts, the climate change podcast. And for you guys submitting to iTunes, you can appreciate trying to squeeze as much as you can into that title. I'm the director. I actually just started it off as something to do like we all do, but I've now shifted into being a 501c3, and so, you know, I think that's partly why Aaron invited me to come on and talk about these issues. And so, in a nutshell, what I talk about is it kind of an echoing there? Okay. How do we adapt to climate change? And so, you know, the bigger issue of climate change, carbon emissions, I'm sort of on the flip side. How are we going to adapt to sea level rise, to drought, and all those things? And so, that's my niche, and my model is I have experts on to talk about that, but I also have journalists on, I have scientists on, and it's a weekly podcast, and it's been a bit of a journey for me. And, you know, Aaron sort of wanted us to talk about a few things here, and so actually finding guests and what I want to communicate to the public on this issue. Adaptation is not so political right now, but it's going to get political. How are we going to spend our money? And climate change is already controversial enough. If you think about it in the news, it's basically separated into two camps. And so adaptation is this kind of area out there that hasn't really been thought about too much. And so I'm curious in the years ahead how people are going to respond to it. And with the podcast, I have guests on. We have probably like an hour-long conversation, and it's mainly folks that are experts in this area, but occasionally I'll get on sort of controversial guests. And I had Mark Morano, and if you are in the climate change universe, Mark Morano is a huge skeptic. He runs Climate Depot. He had some movies. He's really just, I followed him for years, and he's quite foul in a lot of ways, but he's a lovely guy. You know, he's working toward the end of the planet, and yet, you know, I remember that when I was Skyping with him, when it first came on, because I knew who he was, I'm seeing his picture, I'm like, I'm about to talk to Mark Morano. I mean, he worked for Rush Limbaugh, worked for Senator Inhofe, and so the point is that I was able to get him on, and we had a long conversation about what motivates him. I wasn't there to debate him. He's a professional debater. And so we had a long conversation, and then I had someone else come on, Randy Olson, who's a scientist who deals with science communication, and we basically took apart Mark's conversation, and Mark knew we were going to do this to his credit. And that is actually, I probably received most of my best feedback on that one because it was so interesting. And, you know, I want to get to some of the other talks here, but just the point of the podcast is climate change is really a rich topic. I think it's an optimistic podcast that I have, and I don't do doom and gloom, and I think that is kind of feeding into maybe the political narrative that's going on out there. And I think I like to share some good things, but I want to kind of shift let someone else chat. I don't want to talk too long here. Colin?
Hey everyone. I am the host and producer of the Got Science podcast. It's brought to you by the Union of Concerned Scientists. We're a science advocacy organization. UCS works on a number of issues: climate change, sea level rise, fossil fuels, contribution to a warming planet, nuclear weapons, and inequitable food systems. So we bring the science to bear on these issues in the hopes that we would help affect policy and create good policies for a healthy and sustainable planet. We had talked a year ago, we were thinking about doing a podcast and getting into this, and then we sort of had a plan for that, and then the election happened last year, and that kind of threw a bit of a monkey wrench in what we were planning. We were planning to talk about renewable energy technologies and, you know, sort of good, optimistic tech stuff, and we were suddenly plunged into doom and despair, and we decided we had to sort of shift our plan. So we launched last February, and the way we're handling our programming is that we're doing sort of every fourth or so episode, we're focusing on defending science in the Trump administration. We're then also very committed to environmental justice, so we sort of do about every fourth episode on issues of environmental justice and science, and why science is so important to sort of bring data to issues of environmental justice. And then we talk to scientists about what they're working on. We've done issues on North Korea and you know, a number of things. But as Aaron was saying, we're a nonprofit, we're a 501c3, and we have to be careful about how we talk about politics or don't talk about politics. We can't, we're nonpartisan, we can't endorse candidates, etc. But I think we really tackle the policy and political issues through the science. I mean, we just bring science to the table and try to, you know, make that sort of the entry point and connecting it to people's lives. Why is this important to me in my everyday life? So I think, I guess I'll just kind of stop there and pass the baton, and then maybe we'll get to questions.
All right, hey everyone. So who came into town, who came from out of town today? Who's here from somewhere else? All right, welcome to DC. Surprise, we're in for a little bit of politics. Who would have figured, right? So I'm Jordan Cooper. I'm the host of Public Interest Podcast, and I'll just tell you a little bit about what it is, what it's all about, why it came to be, and what I hope to accomplish with it. Boom, boom, boom. So in 2014, I ran for the Maryland House of Delegates, and I lost. And I was trying to represent Bethesda, which is the most educated and among the wealthiest areas in the United States. Surprise, 5 out of 6 registered Democrats didn't care to turn out to vote, and about 9 out of 10 adults who might have voted just didn't. All right, so I'm surprised. Okay, you know, I've knocked 12,000 doors, do this, that, and the other, lots of mail. Why did nobody vote? And so I had an idea. Let me try to scale a meet and greet where people can actually get a sense of knowing their politicians, and in such a way, not only would they feel like they're more invested in these people, but also I was hoping, well, maybe I could inoculate them against political expenditures. What do I mean by that? So imagine that you over there are running for office, and I'm running for office. And we each get to reach out to the audience, and everybody gets to meet us. And, you know, surprise, no surprise really, they choose you. Everyone likes you better. But I'm rich. It's been tattooed. So I'm very rich, right? So I'm going to spend $1 million convincing everyone in the room with TV ads, with direct mail, with radio ads, and I'm going to pay everyone up here. You guys, thank you. I'm paying you to knock on doors for me. But no one's buying it because everybody already knows him and wants him to be their politician. In that way, I was hoping maybe you can reduce the influence of money in politics. But then I went further. I said, gosh, in this age of anti-establishment populism, you know, everyone hates politicians. I'm scratching my head. Aren't politicians the most noble and honorable callings? I mean, to serve your fellow man, society, to dedicate yourself to learning about sewers and roads and budgets and all sorts of things which can be quite boring because you care about your community. Somehow they've gotten a bad rap. So why is that? I was knocking doors. They say, hey, Jordan, you look like a nice guy. Why would you want to run for office? Because every time they read about a politician, that politician screwed up. But I thought, well, what about the majority of politicians I know? I know many. I've been in politics for 14 years. I know I don't look much older than 14 years old, but I've been around for a bit. So I know these guys. They're not doing anything wrong, but when they answer constituent services, when they propose a boring bill and this or the other, they're too boring for traditional news to cover them. So no surprise, everyone who reads about politicians says, oh, this is all negative, therefore all politicians must be bad. So let me create a positive news source that allows people to get to meet their politicians, but also focuses on how noble and honorable the calling is. And finally, I said, well, look, there's also this rising hatred and intolerance. There's xenophobia on immigrants, anti-Semitism on Jews, homophobia on gays, and racism on blacks, and all sorts of things. And I thought, well, maybe it's because people don't know the people that they don't like. Maybe if I could create dialogue with difference, and create some sort of opportunity for us to get to know each other, for liberals to listen to Trump voters and see exactly what makes them tick, and maybe they're not bad people after all. That's kind of the theory behind Public Interest Podcast. So I'm 264 episodes in. I've done governors, Nobel Prize laureates, Pulitzer Prize winners, went to Europe, did a few politicians over there. I've done national news correspondents, a whole bunch of people. And it's all about, I basically asked them, why is the world a better place? Because you're in it. How do you advance the public interest? What are your motivations? What do you hope your legacy will be? And in that way, I'm hoping to create a positive impact on the political world and the non-political world. I've done priests and rabbis and food kitchen executives. So thanks for joining us today, and I think this should be a great discussion.
Great. Yeah, so let's open it up for questions and for comments. And before we do that, I should also just do a brief plug. One of my other hats is hosting Gerd Night DC. So tomorrow we're doing a show with the Podfest. We'll be doing some live recordings, and we'll also have a speaker who's an expert in accents and how our brains process accents. So it'll be very audio-tastic adventure, and that'll be after you wrap up here, and it's just going to be over at DC 9, which is a few blocks away, right off U Street. And Doug is going to be one of our speakers at the Nerd Event, because climate adaptation, it's nerdy, it's fun.
I have a question.
What's your name?
My name is Micah from Report Podcast. I have a question about the explanatory comma. You all have very specific, wonky podcasts. So how much of your time is spent saying, you know, I say this thing, and you say, okay, well, let me explain to my audience, or do you assume that your audience already knows what you're talking about?
Can I jump in and take that one? So I do this all the time on my podcast. So there are a lot of acronyms in politics. So whenever someone says an acronym, I take a step back and say, and for our listeners who don't know, you know, CMS means Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. All right, and okay, what is Medicare, what is Medicaid? Or refer to some sort of federal program or state program, and I just explain, oh, that's PEPCO, that's the Potomac Electric Power Company. They're a power distributor, not a power generator. And next, and then I move on and allow the guests to just elaborate on whatever it is they're doing. So I feel comfortable interrupting my guests. I interject. And I speak directly to the audience. I've gotten feedback. I've had 80,000 listens in the last year. I've gotten feedback from some of my listeners who say, look, I really appreciate it. It made me feel like I was part of the conversation. So instead of my listeners feeling like they're a fly on the wall, they actually tell me, well, look, I felt like you were reaching out and speaking directly to me in my car when I was listening to your podcast, because I didn't know what they were talking about. And some things, you're right. When I speak to these guys, hospital executives and all these healthcare people talking about very specific diseases and body, you know, organs and muscles and everything, I have to explain. And I think my listeners are grateful for that. So thank you for the question.
I would say that when I come up with my questions, I think a lot of us do that. You know, you have a page of questions, and you might go through a third of them. I try to simplify the questions as much as I can, and I like to think I have the brain of an 8th grader in some ways. It's like, all right, how would that person ask that question? And these topics are very wonky, and you know, I think we're very reactive too when we're doing these interviews, is that you'll ask a question, and if you have a scientist on, and they sort of go down a rabbit hole of very wonky information, you respond quickly, and you know, you try to dumb it down a sheet for your next question. And so you just have to, yeah, I mean, I think of like my audience out there, I have very highly trained people, but then I have members of the public that are just interested in the topic. I'm always trying to be sensitive to what their needs might be.
I've seen a few podcasts do reference episodes for topics that they know they're going to come back to over and over again. So they'll say, you know, go check out episode 96 when we talked about healthcare at length, because wow, that got complex.
I would say for the God Science podcast, I think part of the beauty of me doing the podcast is that I'm not a scientist and I don't really understand half of the stuff that we're talking about. So I find it very easy to break things down or to sort of dig in a little bit more. But we really start off at the beginning with a set of questions that are really, you know, and I don't want to say dumbed down, because I don't like that term. I mean, I think we're just trying to make it accessible and really just ask the extra question, sort of digging in a little bit so that everybody can understand.
There was a phrase from a psychology journal that a science communicator passed on to me once that I feel like is really generally applicable, but it was, never underestimate your audience's intelligence, never overestimate their specific knowledge.
Hi, I'm Maria, local here in Washington, D.C. I too come from a background in politics. Question for all the panelists, and the first gentleman alluded to your specific podcast, but I'm curious, what has been your most popular podcast, and why do you think that guest said yes to you?
Go for it.
You know what? That Mark Morano episode, it actually is my all-time most popular one, and it's actually not that old. So I've only been doing this for 14, 15 months, and so I think you know, your growth is like that, and so that's part of it. And a lot of it's just, you know, how is it promoted out there? And so it started showing up in weird areas, like even on skeptic websites, and so I got eyeballs in areas I wouldn't typically get, and I was very encouraged by that. I want that, but I got Mark Morano on because just I was introduced to him by the guy who actually came on afterwards, Randy Olson, who I mentioned, who does science. Aaron and I know Randy very well, and Randy is just a force of nature, and so he has a Rolodex that you just would kill for, and he introduced me to Mark. Mark agreed to come on, and agreed for me and Randy to kind of kick him in the teeth afterwards, and so, yeah, I guess that's how that ultimately, you get guests on for the most random reasons, but have new guests, you know, create opportunities for new guests. You know, it's kind of exciting. I've had 53 episodes, and that one guest helped me introduce. I end every episode with, if you could recommend one guest for me to come on, who would you recommend? And my listeners are actually, they look forward to when I ask that question. It's a very final question I ask, and I've gotten some great names out of that.
So my most popular episode is, it was released last January with Chris Carson, who at the time was the national president of the League of Women Voters. And the reason it was the most popular episode is that the League of Women Voters, so whenever an episode goes live, I do lots of things. One of the things I do is I email the communications person and the guest from that organization, and I say, your episode's live, would you please share it, and that's X, Y, and Z. And they included it in a national, regular, routine email newsletter that went out to all 50 states, and then the League of Women Voters also has chapters in all different counties in all the different states. I'm an active League of Women Voters member in Montgomery County, Maryland. That helped me land the original interview, but again, it was their distribution channel that made it so popular. It was in their email newsletter, and that's what went out there. I've done much more famous and powerful people. I've done former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle. But, you know, it's all about how much they're willing to promote it in their network. So I really think that the willingness of your guests to promote the episode that features them leads to a lot of the increased listenership and exposure that you might get from any particular episode.
Great. I would say yes, I agree with that. I work with a lot of scientists who are often very reluctant to promote themselves, so that's a little bit of a challenge for us. But I would say one of our most popular episode was one about living with sea level rise and the stories from chronically flooded communities in Florida. And I think, I suspect it was interesting to people because we were telling stories about people on the ground that are living in communities that are just chronically flooded every, more than, every month or so they're being flooded. So I think that was an interesting one that got a lot of listens. And I would say the other one was we were able to interview Mustafa Ali, who was the head of the EPA's Environmental Justice office, and he resigned shortly after Trump came in. And it was just, for some reason, perhaps he promoted it more through his networks, and that's how it sort of got a higher listenership. But I think it does help when the people you're interviewing either have, a name, a recognizable name, or a following.
I just want to follow up on Jordan's point about the idea of your guests promoting it too. I got Bill McKibben on, and if you've heard of him, he's a giant in the climate change universe. And when I published that, I was just so excited. I'm like, this is it. I'm NPR now. Everything's changing now. Publish, let the downloads come in, average, completely average. And Bill McKibben didn't lift a finger to promote it, and I don't hold it against him. He's just moved on to hanging out with former presidents, and so sometimes you don't get them thinking about your podcast once they've hung up the phone. So.
And it's also what the value add is for them. Like, I've interviewed national news correspondents for CBS and CNN. Every day, they're in front of a camera with tens of millions of Americans watching them. And although I was like, oh, well, of course they're going to say my podcast live on television and boom, it's over, right? But what's the incentive for them? What's the value add for them? It's not news for them. They don't want to be the story. They want to be the journalist in that particular case. So you're always trying to present the value add case to these guests. And right, the high profile doesn't correlate into any sort of increased listenership for your own show.
Hi, I'm Tess, and I actually work for a 501c3, and I was hoping for those in the panel that have their podcast as a 501c3, can you talk about maybe troubles you run into with your content being a 501c3 and even monetizing your podcast, any challenges you might have there?
I'm going to just defer. I'm actually leading a panel, or a session this afternoon talking about all those issues. So I think it's at 3 o'clock.
So the Union of Concerned Scientists has been around for a number of years, and everyone who works there is very sort of steeped in. I mean, we don't raise money on the air in our podcasts. We're a large organization. We have a development office that raises money for everything we do, so we don't really have to do that. But I would say that we're very we're careful about our topics because we can't engage in politics. We can't. And what I mean by that is we can't endorse candidates or do things like that. I mean, we can certainly hold the Trump administration's feet to the fire about their anti-science policies, etc. But yeah, so I'd be happy to talk to you, on the side about your specific, but.
Yeah, I think some of the just the way all of our legal structures around politics work, they're very confusing, and I think they've gotten confusing to the point where they actually can have a chilling effect on people. But the bottom line is, if you're a nonprofit and people are making charitable contributions that they can deduct from their taxes, you just can't tell people how to vote. You can tell them to vote, you can tell them to care about issues, you just can't tell them who to vote for. And that's kind of the simple way I think about it. And at the same time, I think for most people who are podcasting, especially if you're doing it in your capacity as a private citizen, First Amendment rules, and just say whatever you want. How are we doing?
We have time for about 2 more questions. I have a question.
Yeah.
So in an environment where, I'm trying to think of like the least political way I can say this, or the most political way. So when facts themselves are being held as political statements, when they're not at all political statements and facts, like how do you manage with that in the environment, and have you run up against that where no, this is not an opinion, this is a statement of fact, even though someone might then say, well, that's just some theory.
Yeah, actually, I did a panel on this with the Poynter Institute, and they were doing fact checking for science journalists, and it was very much like fact checking. Are we getting that right yet? And it was really interesting to hear all those perspectives, including from journalists who were saying, I fact check all these claims, whether it's about climate science or anything else, and it feels like I fact check them, and then it just goes into the ether, and people aren't like it doesn't fix the people who are spreading misinformation. So the main way that I've approached it, especially as online sources of misinformation have become so prolific, is to underscore not just why facts matter, the truth matters, or when science matters, or anything like that, but to underscore what happens when policy is based off misinformation. So it's not just enough to go out there and say, look, sea level rise is real. It's also to say, in states like North Carolina and Florida, where state officials and people who work in the public interest haven't been able to use the best available science on sea level rise, I can point to communities that's harming, and I can show you what the consequences of that are. So it's the consequences of facts, not just whether or not someone does or doesn't accept the facts.
And Alex, I think that the question that you're asking truly goes towards a single word, which is trust. To what extent are you able to build a community that trusts you and what you're trying to do? And to that end, for instance, on my show, even though I'm very partisan, as was Aaron mentioned earlier, in a particular area of my life, on my show, I try to be completely nonpartisan. I've made an effort to include right-wing Republicans, libertarians, European politicians, who are not liberal at all. I interviewed a Danish politician who's anti-EU and anti-immigrant, and then people who aren't political at all, people like rabbis and imams and nonprofit executive directors talking about healthcare quality measurement. So I think when people have a sense of trust and also they see where you're coming from, that somewhat addresses the idea of truthiness or fake news. In fact, I even hosted a panel discussion on fake news in May in Washington, D.C. So when you're asking, how are we able to address facts? I think viewers are interested in knowing where you're coming from and how open you are to allowing varying perspectives, particularly contradictory perspectives, to have time on your show.
Again, following up on that trust issues, the guests that you have, I mean, I bring on PhD scientists and the institutions that they're coming from, and so over time, they're trusting you as a host that these conversations that you're having are things that they can trust. Because I'm sure, I'm not a scientist, I've just worked in the science realm for decades, but I'm not a scientist, and maybe I've said some incorrect things. No one's there fact-checking you, but if you want to, if you have a couple episodes where you're just spouting off crap, people are going to figure that out pretty quickly, and it'll reflect in your listener base over time. So, but podcasting, it is a bit the honor system, and you can't do real-time fact-checking, so it's tricky.
Thank you very much.
We interview scientists, so
they become an accuracy bacon.
Well,
Yeah.
but you see, okay, and I don't want to belabor this too long because we only have like a minute, but you understand that the point which you're kind of slightly touching on, I'm not talking about the idea of bringing someone with a differing viewpoint to you that is someone that you can discuss like the causes of something, right? I'm talking specifically about, I'll just say climate change is not something that is politicized, it is real, right? But the notion of whether climate change is real, that's been politicized as like, well, that fact is in question. No, that fact is not in question, so the debate itself is difficult to have because we're starting from a different foundation.
Yeah, we've politicized the nature of facts, or even like, I see yard signs in DC that say like, immigrants matter, science is real, stuff like that. And I'm like, how did that get on a political sign? Science is real. Like, why is this happening? And I think fundamentally, and a lot of lobbyists will tell you this too, if they spend a lot of time in legislatures or on the Hill, it's often not the facts themselves that are in dispute. We often have arguments about the facts because the argument is over which facts are relevant for making policy, right? And that's how we wind up talking past each other a bit. And often, okay, well, if I attack my opponent's facts, their argument will be gone. But really, it's a debate about which facts are relevant to the policies we're debating. That's more fundamental. And I think there's also social scientists who study this, who are fascinating interviews. Zeynep Tufekci is a sociologist. She wrote a book called Twitter and Tear Gas that's all about misinformation, and she did a great interview recently on the Inquiring Minds podcast, all about sort of these shifts in how we get information. So I think there's meta commentary on a lot of this stuff that can be really cool to touch on these topics too. Cool. So we're at time. Great. Thank you all so much for great questions and discussions. Really appreciate it, and hope to see some of you at Nerd Night tomorrow night.
Definitely.